Welcome to my channel, Statistics for Applied Linguistics. I'm Dr. Marnie Menegra, and in this video, we are looking at the introduction to the method section. So there are going to be subsequent videos to discuss how to source the participants, the number of participants you need, how to set up the tests or write the questionnaires. But this one is just the general introduction to the method section. Now, if we recall, the empirical cycle of research is not linear, it is circular. And we've gone through the observation section and how to source background information and start writing your background information section. The induction, which is the creation of the hypothesis and the research questions. We're now looking at the deduction. So again, observation, creation of the idea and the research hypothesis based on information or patterns. Induction, creation of the hypothesis. Deduction, the hypothesis is transformed into a prediction. And in this section, we're going to look at how are we going to test this hypothesis. So we're going to write out the method section. And then afterwards, we will do the testing and the evaluation. So the main sections of the method section. In the previous video, when we looked at sections of a thesis, if you are taking the Master's in English Language Teaching at URV, you do want to add in 2 more subsections to the method section, which is the research design. This is a general introduction to the research section. So it's an introduction to the chapter, setting the reader up to let them know how the design was put together. Whether it's a pre-test, post-test design, a questionnaire study, you're going to set the reader up for the following subsections. The participants who participate in the study, describing their background variables. Again, we are not going to use any personal information of the participants. We need to make sure that their data is protected. The materials, here I have the measurement tools, but these are also other tools in the study. So if you're using a mobile application, you're going to want to describe what that mobile application is, where it is from, the history, how it is used. That will go in this section as well. The procedure, this is your recipe. This is how you or where you explain what was done in a manner that anyone can read it and repeat it. If someone cannot repeat your study based on how you've written the procedure, that means you did not write it clear enough. And the final section for this thesis degree is your data analysis. For your thesis, you should include the data analysis at the end of the method section. This is where you're going to discuss which tools you are going to use to test, to examine what was done in the testing. Okay, so this would be whether you're using a t-test or an analysis of variance. Now, one other thing to consider are our variables of interest. So a variable is an operationalized version of a construct. It can be measured and it can be manipulated. So an independent variable, the cause, this is the cause or the input, or sometimes referred to as the explanatory variable. The dependent variable is the effect, and this is the result of, or the response, or the outcome. And the criteria for evaluation is reliability. Is it possible to replicate the study? Validity. Does the hypothesis relationship or relation accurately reflect reality? So we want to make sure that there's no issues with validity, but there are types of validity. So the first is construct validity. Do your tests, or does your study, do your tests measure the properties intended? So if you use a statewide general exam to see if the students are learning English and you have that as a pretest, but then your procedure, they're looking at very specific colloquial phrases from a television series. But then you use the standardized test again as the post-test. even though it's a standardized test that is well regarded, it's not measuring the properties intended, which is the colloquial language that the students are learning in the procedure. So there has to be a match between the testing and what is being done in the procedure. And internal validity. Does the hypothesis describe a causal relationship, or are there confounding variables? So if you're doing a study where you have students that are being tested throughout the school year, and you're learning in English class, but half of your students are taking lessons outside of class as well, their lessons outside of class is a confounding variable that can influence their performance on the post-test. So another one is the external validity. Can you generalize the findings of the study? Is the sample too specific that you can't generalize it? Or do you not have enough participants? So if you only have 3 participants in the study, you cannot generalize any of the findings. The sample size is just too small. Now, we looked at the variables of interest, which are the dependent and independent variables. We also have variables of disinterest. And variables of disinterest are other extraneous properties. So the first is the confounding variable, which I just mentioned. So it's related to both the independent and dependent variable, and it may influence the relationship. So you've got an interference happening here. And this is the example that I just mentioned, testing the student's performance in English class through the semester. But others, or some of the students, are taking English lessons at a private academy. These English lessons at the private academy are going to influence the results. Control. So this is likely related to the independent and dependent variables. It is measured and the effects are controlled. So this is where you can control the environment. Or if you're testing 2 groups of students, but they have different styles of instruction, a control could be making sure they have the exact same teacher for both classes. So, and then we have our background variables. These are not related to the dependent and independent variables, but they are relevant to the study to know how representative our group was. So often we collect the background variables in a pre-questionnaire, and this will tell us the age or ethnicity or location or the language skills of the participants. When you collect the background variables, the information from the pre-questionnaire with the background variables does not go in the results section. This goes into the participant section in the method. So you might have on a pre-questionnaire a section for background information or background variables, and then a second section where you're actually testing them information. That information then could go into the results section, but the background variables do not. Okay, so in the degree program, you have the opportunity to do an experimental versus a non-experimental thesis. Now, choosing a non-experimental method does not mean that you can avoid statistics. Now, I'm going to go over some non-experimental and some experimental methods and give you some ideas of the stats that you can use. And this is going to change depending on what your hypothesis statement says. But for some examples of non-experimental studies, you could do a systemic literature review. For this, you're reviewing all of the articles in high-ranked journals, usually for particular years, maybe the last 5 years, on the topic of language learning and chatbots. This is just an example that I've given. So depending on how you categorize the data, if you're comparing the studies against each other, so if you find ways to categorize and group the different studies, you could actually compare the data with t-tests or ANOVAs or chi-squares, again, depending on the hypothesis. Another thing that you can do, or another type of study, is a corpus analysis. A corpus is a database of language. So you can use an existing corpus or you can create your own. But let's say if you're looking at all of the mentions of chatbot use in the classroom in social media. So you're going through Twitter and Facebook and you're collecting all of the statements and you're collecting a corpus, or you're creating a corpus. You're going to analyze this with typically done with logarithms or logs. Now, if you wanted to compare existing data, so as an example, you want to compare the style of textbooks in Spain to the style of textbooks in Mexico for English language teaching, then you would want to code the information, and you can use a t-test or an ANOVA. Another thing you can look at is a comparison of existing data over a period of time. So as an example, if you want to compare the effectiveness of teaching EFL in Spain and Mexico over the last 20 years, and I'm not sure how you're going to measure effectiveness. This is just an example. But in this case, you would use a linear regression. So these are examples of non-experimental studies. If we want to look at experimental studies, the first one is a single questionnaire study, and this is not recommended for a master's thesis. Sometimes people don't recognize that if you're putting a questionnaire out to participants, this is experimental. So I've seen questionnaire studies classified by the students as non-experimental. That is not true. As soon as there's a questionnaire and you've got participants answering, this becomes experimental. Now, a single questionnaire is not robust enough for a master's level thesis. This is a good study for an undergraduate thesis. But for this type of study, as an example, you want to know how students feel about using ChatGPT in language learning. The test is going to usually use Likert scales. And if you have less than 100 participants, you would analyze this with a chi-square. If you have greater than 100 participants, you could use Cronbach's alpha or Krippendorf's alpha. Now, there are pre-questionnaire to post-questionnaire studies, and questionnaires usually collect qualitative data, but the data can be coded. And so in this case, if you're comparing students' perceptions of their experiences, and you're collecting data on intercultural competence based on Deardorff's theory of IC, and this is before and after a telecollaboration. So I've seen this one done. Here, if you have two groups and you've coded the data, you can compare the pre and post questionnaires with repeated measures ANOVA. If there's only one group, you can compare the information with a paired samples t-test. For just a single test, an individual test, let's say you're testing two different groups and you want to see if if there's a difference in style of instruction. You're comparing their performance on a standard English test. So I've got one school that uses a lot of CLIL. I've got the other school that uses grammar translation. These are different institutions. They have different methods of teaching. I can take a standardized exam, give them to the students in both schools. In this case, I'm going to use an independent samples t-test to analyze the results. A simple pre-test, post-test design. The pre-test sets the baseline for what the students know, and the post-test will measure the growth from the onset of the study to the conclusion. So if you're testing the student's knowledge before and after the procedure, and you'd use the same tests as in the pre and post questionnaire study. Now, one that we see most often is a pre-questionnaire, pre-test, post-test, and post-questionnaire. So again, you're testing the growth in knowledge, but you're also collecting background information and overall perceptions and qualitative data. So depending on the types of research questions, that's going to determine the tests used, but generally we're going to see t-tests and ANOVAs and chi-squares in this analysis. So this, again, as you can see, whether or not you're doing experimental or non-experimental, you're going to be using statistics in your thesis. And this concludes this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.